By the time the first whiteout rolled across the prairie ridge, Owen Calvert's cabin looked no different than any other. What the neighbors didn't know was that behind a wall of blankets and hand-cut pine shelves, he'd built a room no storm could touch. Before the snow sets in, tell us where you're listening from. And if quiet frontier stories speak to you, warm your boots by the fire and stay for the next tale. Owen Calvert's life had been marked by winters, but the winter of 1869 was the one that defined him. That year, a sudden blizzard buried the prairie ridge under feet of snow. The wind tore across the land, howling through the trees, making the air bitter and sharp. His brother Eli had been a quiet man, strong and steady, with a sharp mind for ranching. But that winter he was caught unprepared. Eli had gone out to check the herd, as he did every day, leaving Owen behind at the cabin to tend to the fire. The storm hit faster than either of them had expected, and by the time Eli realized the danger, it was too late. Owen had stayed inside, unaware of the storm's full fury, until it was too late to act. By nightfall, Eli hadn't returned. Owen assumed he'd gotten stuck somewhere, but as the days passed, it became clear that something was wrong. The snow kept falling, and Eli was still nowhere to be found. On the third day, Owen finally ventured out into the storm, calling his brother's name. The wind howled louder now, and the snow had drifted into deep, treacherous mounds. It wasn't until he reached the farthest reaches of the ridge that he found him. Eli, frozen, buried beneath the snow, just a few hundred yards from the cabin. The storm had claimed him, and Owen was left with nothing but the bitter weight of regret. The grief that followed was not immediate. It came later, like the slow burn of a wound that wouldn't heal. But it wasn't the loss that haunted Owen the most. It was the helplessness, the realization that despite all their experience, neither of them had been prepared for what had come. The cabin they had built together, sturdy and practical, had been enough for regular winters, but not for something as ferocious as this one. And in that moment, Owen understood something essential. If he didn't change, if he didn't learn from this, he'd end up just like Eli, taken by something he couldn't control. That winter became a turning point for him. As the seasons passed, Owen spent countless hours thinking about what had happened. It wasn't just the grief that gnawed at him. It was the knowledge that the next storm would be even worse if he wasn't ready. He'd seen the signs, the way the wind cut across the prairie, the way the air carried an edge of coldness that hinted at what was to come. And so, Owen began making plans. He would build something more, something that could withstand the worst the ridge had to offer. He would never again be caught unprepared. The hidden winter room became his obsession, born from the scar of that winter. The ridge was a wild thing, unforgiving and harsh, and Owen knew it like the back of his hand. The wind never knocked at the door of his cabin. It simply slipped through the cracks, howling across the land as though it owned the place. Owen had lived on this ridge long enough to understand its moods. He knew when the weather was turning, when the sky turned that shade of gray that heralded snow, and when the wind carried a cold bite that promised more than just a passing storm. Since the storm that took Eli, Owen had been working steadily, but now the task was taking shape. The cabin that had sheltered him and his brother for years was no longer enough. The winter room, hidden from view, was more than just a place to store supplies. It was a sanctuary against nature itself, a refuge built to survive the worst. Owen was determined that nothing, not even the cruelest wind or the heaviest snowfall, would ever catch him unprepared again. He spent hours working on the cabin, reinforcing its walls and floors. The logs he had used before were sturdy enough for a typical winter, but Owen wasn't planning for ordinary conditions. He was preparing for something more. As he worked, he considered the land around him, the way the wind swept across the ridge, cutting through the trees with an unrelenting force. The ridge had its own rhythm, its own kind of logic, and Owen needed to understand it completely if he was going to outsmart it. Building was a slow, deliberate process. Most people built cabins quickly, eager to finish before winter set in, but Owen had learned from Eli's death that haste led to mistakes. He made sure each log was placed carefully, each joint secured with precision. He added an extra layer of insulation, packing sawdust between the logs to block out the cold. No crack, no gap was left unchecked. The cabin was becoming a fortress, built not just for comfort, but for survival. The winter room was where the real work lay, though. Behind the outer walls, hidden from sight, Owen constructed a space unlike any other. A space where warmth would be trapped and preserved, where the fire in the hearth could burn low but never die. He used thick stone for the foundation, layering it beneath the earth to keep the room cool in summer and warm in winter. The entrance was concealed behind a heavy, rotating shelf, a clever mechanism he had devised so that no one could find it without knowing exactly where to look. As the days passed, the weather grew colder. The wind began to howl in earnest, pushing through the cracks of the cabin with a ferocity that reminded Owen of that fateful winter. But the cabin held firm. The room behind the shelves, still a secret, was his peace of mind. No matter what the ridge threw at him, Owen knew that he had built it right. This time, the storm wouldn't win. Owen had always believed in practicality, in building things to last. The hidden winter room was no exception. The shelf door that concealed it was something he'd designed with care, the kind of solution that only came to him after weeks of considering every possible way to keep his secrets safe. He didn't want anyone to stumble across it by mistake, especially not the neighbors, who often dropped by for an evening drink or a meal. This room was more than just a shelter from the cold. It was a safeguard, a fortress, and it had to stay hidden. The idea had come to him slowly, like all good plans. He remembered how the wind had found every crack in the walls during the last storm, how the cold had crept in through even the smallest of gaps. And he remembered Eli, the way he had gone out into that storm with no better protection than a woolen coat and a thick pair of boots. He couldn't help but think that if Eli had known how to hide a place like this, maybe things would have been different. Maybe Eli would have had a place to retreat to, a safe haven, where the storm couldn't reach him. Owen spent 2 days in the cabin, working late into the night, assembling the rotating shelf that would cover the entrance to the winter room. The wood was seasoned, thick enough to hold its own against the harshest elements. He cut and shaved the edges, making sure it would fit snugly against the wall, with no gaps for wind to slip through. When the shelf was complete, he installed the hinges, strong and sturdy, knowing that even a bear wouldn't be able to pry it open. The shelf would rotate, concealing the room, then swing back into place with ease, hiding it completely from view. The mechanism was simple, but effective. Owen had learned from the traps he'd set in the wild for years. A little bit of ingenuity went a long way. He fashioned a locking pin that would hold the shelf firmly in place, but it could be released quickly with a twist of the wrist. This way, no one could ever stumble upon the hidden room by accident. The cabin would appear as it always had, a humble home built for one man and one man alone. When it was finished, Owen stood back to admire his work. The shelf door blended perfectly with the rest of the cabin's interior. If you didn't know it was there, you would never guess it was anything more than a storage unit, perhaps filled with blankets, tools, or firewood. No one would be the wiser, not even the most curious of visitors. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Owen stood by the fire and took a long, deep breath. The air outside was cold and sharp, but inside the cabin was warm, protected. The shelf door swung closed with a soft click, and for the first time since Eli had passed, Owen felt the weight of worry lift from his shoulders. He was ready. This winter he would survive. Owen Calvert's cabin had always been a place of simplicity, built from the land with little more than a saw and a steady hand. But now it had become something else, something far more deliberate. Each log, each nail, each plank of wood was placed with a purpose. The cabin wasn't just a shelter anymore, it was a fortress, a place that could survive the harshest winters, where no wind or storm could find its way inside. The hidden winter room was now fully concealed behind the rotating shelf, but there was still more to be done. Owen's thoughts turned to the interior, to the warmth and preservation he would need to make it through another blizzard. A fire could only do so much in a cabin as old as his. The cold would creep in no matter how tightly he sealed the windows or stuffed the cracks in the walls. It wasn't enough to just survive the storm. He needed to be able to live comfortably in it. The first step was wool. A fabric he had relied on his entire life. Thick, warm, and durable, wool was the material of choice for long winters. Owen spent hours gathering his blankets, stacking them high in the corner of the room. Each one was carefully folded, stacked in a way that allowed air to circulate and prevent them from becoming musty or damp. He used them not just for warmth, but for insulation. The wool would act as a buffer between the cold air and the warmth of the room, trapping heat and keeping the space comfortable no matter how low the temperature dropped outside. Next came the iron. Owen had always preferred the durability of steel over wood when it came to the essentials. His fire tools were made from iron, his stove and pots were heavy with the weight of the metal. But iron wasn't just for cooking or heating. He had learned to use it as a means of reinforcement, a material that could withstand the constant battering of the elements. The door to the hidden room, though concealed, had to be sturdy. Iron hinges and a lock were essential to ensure it would not only open and close smoothly, but also remain secure through the worst of the storms. He had fashioned a lock that would keep it shut, a simple iron bar that slid into place with the twist of a hand. Finally, there was the smoke. Owen had long since perfected the art of the fire. He knew how to stoke it to burn low, to heat the cabin without filling it with smoke. But the winter room would need more than just a small fire to keep it warm. He installed a small stove in the center of the room where he could keep a low, steady flame burning through the long, cold nights. The stove would be fueled by wood, and the chimney, carefully crafted, would vent the smoke outside without disturbing the air inside. No smoke would seep into the room, no heat would be wasted. Owen's work was slow, but it was exacting. He knew that each detail, no matter how small, could be the difference between life and death. This time, nothing would catch him off guard. The first snow arrived quietly, a few flurries here and there, dusting the prairie with a light touch, but nothing to worry about. Owen watched from the window of his cabin as the wind swirled the snow in small gusts, feeling the air grow, colder as the day wore on. It was the kind of early winter storm that didn't demand much attention. Yet he had learned long ago that these early snows were the ones that hid the most danger. They were often harbingers of something far worse. The second storm came with more urgency. The wind picked up, and the snow began to fall in thick sheets, blanketing the world outside. Owen secured the door to the cabin, checking that the hidden winter room was still locked tight, just as he had designed it. He knew that this storm was just a warm-up for what was coming. The kind of storm that would test everything he had built, everything he had prepared for. But he wasn't worried yet, not this time. It was the third storm that shook him to his core. It came on a cold morning, colder than any storm he had experienced in years. The sky was a steel gray, the clouds heavy with the promise of something relentless. By midday, the wind was howling so loudly he could barely hear the crackling of the fire. The temperature dropped like a stone, and the snow began to fall in blinding sheets, heavier than anything Owen had seen since that fateful winter. He didn't wait for it to get worse. He had learned that you couldn't afford to wait when the prairie turned against you. The first thing Owen did was make sure the cabin was sealed up tight. He checked the hearth, stoking the fire so it would burn steady through the night. Then he checked the door to the winter room. It remained secure, just as he had planned. But this storm was different. It wasn't just the wind. The cold was seeping in through the cracks faster than he could keep up. The temperature outside was plummeting, and the wind carried a bite that made the walls groan. No storm should have come this early, this hard. But there it was, pushing through the prairie like a freight train, determined to prove that no one was safe from its fury. Owen worked quickly, gathering firewood and stacking it close to the hearth. The storm wasn't going to let up for days, and he knew he'd need every last log to keep the cabin warm. The wind shrieked through the cracks in the walls, rattling the cabin's bones, and Owen stood at the window staring out into the white haze that covered everything. The storm was fierce, but it wasn't the storm that worried him. It was what it meant. It was a reminder of the winters that had taken his brother, and it was a reminder that Owen had prepared for this moment. He was ready. But the question, as always, was whether it would be enough. Owen didn't expect visitors during a storm like this. The wind had risen to a howling crescendo, rattling the cabin's walls and forcing the snow into drifts so deep they swallowed the land. The ridge was cut off from the rest of the world, its vast emptiness stretching out like an unbroken white sea. Anyone caught out in it would be foolish to keep going, so when the knock came at his door, it didn't make sense. The sound was muffled by the wind, but clear enough for Owen to hear. 3 sharp raps, like someone with a purpose, desperate for shelter. He'd been pacing the cabin, keeping the fire stoked and waiting for the storm to pass. The knock interrupted his thoughts, making him freeze. He instinctively turned toward the hidden winter room, the only place left unguarded from the storm's fury. It was as he had designed it, warm, dry, and protected, yet still out of sight. He hesitated for a moment. No one was supposed to be out in this. No one ever came this way during a blizzard. Owen hadn't seen a soul in days, and he had no reason to believe anyone would come now. His instincts told him to keep quiet, to let the storm bury whatever foolish soul was knocking. But something about the rhythm of the knock, steady, insistent, made him uneasy. It wasn't a random wanderer, lost and stumbling. Whoever was out there had a purpose. Owen grabbed his rifle and crossed the cabin, pulling the heavy wooden door open just enough to peer out. The wind blasted his face, and for a moment he could see nothing but white. Then, through the haze, he caught sight of a figure. It was a man stumbling through the snow, his face hidden by a thick scarf. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moving with the deliberate steps of someone who had been out in the cold too long. Owen squinted, trying to make out his face, but the man's back was turned, and his posture gave nothing away. His breath came out in thick clouds of fog, his body shivering against the cold. "Can I help you?" Owen called out, his voice barely rising above the wind's howl. The man stopped, looking up toward the door. His eyes were wide with the desperation of someone who had been pushed to the edge. "Please," the man said, his voice rough from the cold. "My wheel broke back the ridge. My family's trapped. We can't make it back through this storm. We need shelter." Owen knew this moment could change everything. The hidden winter room wasn't meant for strangers, especially not with the storm so strong, with food stores stretched thin and firewood barely enough to last. But the man was pleading, and something in Owen's chest tightened. "I'll help," Owen said, stepping aside. "Come in." The man stumbled forward, and Owen quickly closed the door behind him. Inside, warmth washed over the man like a flood. He looked around, his eyes darting to the fire and then to the back of the cabin. But Owen knew he couldn't let the winter room's secret slip. This wasn't just a matter of kindness, it was a matter of survival. The man stepped inside, shaking off the cold like a dog shaking water. His ragged breath filled the cabin, a desperate wheeze that seemed to freeze the air around him. Owen didn't offer pleasantries. There was no time for them. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, warmth bloomed. The fire crackled in the hearth, but Owen knew it wouldn't be enough to keep the cold at bay for much longer. "Come in," Owen said, his voice firm as he motioned toward the fire. "Warm yourself. I'll bring your family inside once I've got them settled." The man didn't argue. He was too cold to do anything but comply, sitting heavily in a worn chair near the fire. Owen watched him for a moment, noting the man's eyes. They were glassy, distant, but Owen could see the exhaustion, the desperation, in them. His clothes were tattered, frayed at the edges. His boots, nearly worn through, left a trail of wet snow on the floor. Owen grabbed a wool blanket from the corner, tossing it over the man's shoulders. The wool would help. It was one of the many preparations Owen had made, stacking blankets like supplies for a war he never wanted to fight. Wool, the kind his brother had once mocked for being too heavy, was a necessary investment now. "I've got a winter room," Owen said quietly, not wanting to alarm the man. "It's warmer. I'll bring your family in there." The man nodded, not speaking, but his eyes asking the question. What was the winter room? Owen didn't explain. He knew the answer would come soon enough. Instead, he moved toward the door, opened it, and stepped out into the fierce wind. Outside, the storm had thickened, and the snow had begun to settle in deep, soft drifts. The ridge was cloaked in white. The landscape blurred into a sea of gray. Owen squinted through the blizzard, looking for the figures he knew had to be there, the woman and children. They wouldn't have made it far without help, especially in this storm. He didn't have to search long. He found them, huddled together behind a cluster of trees. The woman was wrapped in a thin shawl, her face pale and drawn, the children close by her side, wrapped in whatever rags they had left to keep warm. They were all shivering, their bodies trembling under the weight of the cold. "Come on," Owen called out over the roar of the wind, pulling the woman toward him. She didn't question him, too cold to argue, too desperate to resist. The children followed, moving with stiff, frozen limbs. Owen helped them back to the cabin one by one, guiding them inside, where the warmth would begin to thaw their frozen skin. When they were all inside, Owen closed the door, keeping the storm at bay. The fire was already crackling brightly, but he knew the real warmth they needed wasn't just from the flames. It was the shelter, the hidden room that would keep them alive through the worst of the blizzard. Owen moved swiftly, lifting the rotating shelf door, revealing the room that had become his greatest secret. The man looked up, eyes wide in disbelief. The hidden room was as warm as promised, a perfect haven against the storm. "No one leaves this room cold," Owen said, his voice steady. "Not again." The cabin was silent, save for the low murmur of the fire and the quiet crackling of burning logs. The storm raged. Outside, but inside, the warmth of the hidden winter room wrapped around them like a thick woolen blanket. The man and his family had settled in, exhausted, but no longer freezing, their shivers subsiding as they huddled near the stove Owen had built into the room. The fire burned steadily in the corner of the room, casting shadows across the faces of the woman and children. Owen had given them the space to rest, offering them food, simple but filling stew from his meager stock, a small kindness for people who had no place else to go. Owen watched them for a moment. The man, whose name turned out to be Peter, sat closest to the fire, cradling a small child in his arms. His other two children, a boy and a girl, sat by the stove, their eyes wide as they took in their surroundings. They were all so young, so innocent, and yet the storm had thrust them into a situation that could have turned deadly. Owen turned away from the family and walked to the far wall. He stood there for a moment, staring out the small window that faced the storm. The wind was relentless, the snow thick and heavy, but the cabin stood firm. For the first time since the blizzard had started, Owen allowed himself a small breath of relief. After a long silence, Peter spoke. His voice was rough, thick with gratitude and exhaustion. "I don't know how we would have made it without you. We were lost. I thought we might freeze out there." His words were heavy, the weight of his experience pressing down on them all. Owen didn't respond immediately. He wasn't looking for praise, and he didn't want to talk about the risks they'd taken in bringing strangers inside, but the question was inevitable. The man's eyes kept darting toward the hidden room, curiosity in every glance. Finally, Peter couldn't hold it back any longer. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief. "How did you know?" Owen didn't look up, but his hands tightened slightly on the edge of the table. He didn't want to explain, didn't want to give away too much. The winter room had been built in secret, a place where he could control what came and went. But in the presence of strangers, he felt a strange sense of duty, as if his preparations had taken on a new purpose. "It's something I built," Owen said quietly. "A place to survive when the storm is too much. You know how it gets out here, how the cold can take you when you're not ready. I didn't want to make the same mistake again." Peter sat still for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I understand," he murmured. For the next several hours, the family stayed by the fire, Owen watching over them in silence. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the hidden winter room there was warmth. There was safety. No one spoke of Eli, but the thought lingered between them, a reminder of how much Owen had lost and how much he had gained by building for survival, not just for himself, but for others too. As the fire flickered and the storm raged on outside, Owen couldn't help but feel a flicker of something like redemption. He had built the room for himself, but now it had become something more. Owen spent the next few days watching the storm through the small window of the cabin, listening to the wind howl and the snow pile higher against the walls. The fire in the hearth burned low at times, but the warmth in the hidden winter room never faltered. The family had settled in, making themselves as comfortable as they could under the circumstances. The children had grown quiet, their eyes wide as they stared at the fire. The woman, whose name was Clara, had fallen asleep with the smallest child in her arms. Peter, however, stayed awake, his eyes flickering toward the winter room. Owen noticed the man's curious glances, but he said nothing. The winter room wasn't a place to be discussed lightly. It was his secret, his safeguard. No one needed to know more than they already had. But then, on the fourth day, it happened. Owen had just finished checking the firewood when he noticed the faintest column of smoke rising from the ridge just outside the cabin. At first he thought it was a trick of the wind, but then he saw it again, a thin plume of smoke threading through the wind and snow. Someone else was out there. Someone had seen the smoke from his cabin. The thought sent a chill through Owen, a knot tightening in his stomach. He knew what that meant. The cabin, the warmth, the shelter. It was all too inviting to someone who had been caught out in the storm, the same storm that had nearly claimed Peter and his family. Owen turned toward the family in the other room, his eyes narrowing. He hadn't been worried about running out of supplies before, but now he wondered. He'd stocked the winter room with food, firewood, and extra blankets, enough for a month at least. But he hadn't prepared for strangers, and with the storm as fierce as it was, there was no telling who might come seeking shelter. Peter caught the look in Owen's eyes, and his expression hardened. "You saw it too, didn't you?" Peter asked, voice low. Owen nodded slowly. "They're coming." The realization settled in like a heavy weight on his chest. There were only so many supplies in the cabin, only so much firewood to burn. The winter room had been built with foresight and careful planning, but it wasn't meant for crowds. Owen had kept it a secret for a reason. It was the last line of defense against the world outside, not a communal refuge. Owen grabbed his rifle and moved quickly to the door, his hand hovering over the latch. He didn't know who was out there, but one thing was certain: they couldn't all fit inside. The fire would attract more, and soon enough his secret would be out. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him, and into the brutal wind. The smoke was heavier now, more distinct, cutting through the storm like a signal. He moved toward it, wary of what was to come. The storm raged with no sign of letting up, as though the entire prairie had been swallowed by the sky. Owen's boots crunched in the deep snow as he walked toward the plume of smoke. His breath came in shallow, visible bursts, and the cold bit at his skin, despite the thick layers of wool he had wrapped himself in. Each step felt heavier, laden with the weight of what might be coming. As he neared the ridge where the smoke had been rising, Owen's heart began to pound. He didn't know who was out there. maybe a group of settlers lost in the storm, maybe more travelers seeking refuge. But the ridge wasn't a place for the unprepared. It wasn't a place for anyone who didn't know how to survive the harsh winters of the prairie. The idea of letting more people into his cabin, into the winter room, unsettled him. He'd built it for himself, for the quiet, cold nights when survival was the only thing that mattered. Now, it felt like something precious, something he couldn't share without losing control. Ahead, he could make out shapes in the snow. Two men hunched against the storm, making their way slowly toward him. Their faces were barely visible beneath layers of cloth, but Owen could see their desperate movements, the way they leaned on each other for support, as if the wind itself was trying to push them off the earth. "Hey!" Owen called, his voice barely audible over the wind. The two men looked up, startled. Owen waved his rifle in the air, gesturing for them to approach. "Come this way, quickly!" They hesitated for a moment, no doubt weighing their options in the storm, but then they moved toward him, one step at a time, until they were close enough to see his face. One of the men had a heavy beard, graying at the edges, his eyes wide with the kind of exhaustion only a storm could produce. The other was younger, likely in his 20s, but the cold had taken a toll on him as well. Both men were clearly in need of shelter. "Thank you," the older man said, his voice hoarse, barely audible. "We didn't know where else to go. The storm, it's too much." Owen nodded grimly. "The cabin's not far. I've got a place for you inside." He turned, motioning for them to follow. "Stay close." As they walked back toward the cabin, the older man spoke again, his voice quieter now. "I don't know what we would have done if we hadn't seen the smoke from your chimney. The blizzards, we got lost trying to find shelter." Owen didn't respond, his mind elsewhere. The cabin was never meant to hold this many people. He had prepared for himself, for solitude. But as they neared the warmth of the door, Owen couldn't bring himself to turn them away. They needed it. And in the end, they were all just trying to survive. He opened the door to the cabin and stepped aside, letting the two men in first. The fire crackled brightly, the warmth from the stove wrapping around them like a welcomed embrace. Owen closed the door behind him and locked it, sealing out the storm once more. And as he stood there watching the two new arrivals settle by the Vityr, Owen knew that his survival would never be a solitary thing again. He had built for himself, but sometimes survival meant more than just the individual. It meant sharing the warmth, even when it felt like there might not be enough to go around.